Please welcome to our virtual stage our next set of speakers, Frederick Chang, Chair of the Department of Computer Science and Founding Director of the Darwin Deason Institute for Cybersecurity at Southern Methodist University, Nidhi Rastogi, Assistant Professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Moderating this session is our very own Kristine Gloria, Director of Artificial Intelligence at Aspen Digital.
Thank you, voice from above. I appreciate the introduction. I'm Kristine Gloria, as she mentioned, with Aspen Digital. I'm so very pleased to welcome all of you to this next conversation, which will focus on the intersection of artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. I think we all have heard AI as one of those hot buzzwords that means everything and also nothing at once. It's in every industry and across all domains, and sparks lots of different imaginations about what it can and cannot do. So for our purposes today, we're going to consider what AI, which in my definition is a constellation of machine learning and natural language processing techniques, means for the cybersecurity field. And I am overjoyed to be joined today with both Nidhi and Fred to really get into this conversation. And so I want to just dive right in. I think, back in 2019, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence asked the National Research Council of the National Academies to conduct a major workshop on AI and cybersecurity. And Fred, as chair of the workshop, I'm curious if there are any key findings that you believe are both germane to this year's Aspen Cyber Summit discussion, but in general, in terms of the future casting of AI within cybersecurity.
Yeah, thanks, Kristine. The workshop took place over 2 days and was 100. The report itself was 100 pages. So I'll quickly try to summarize it. I think it's fair to say that one key point that came out of it was that there is a degree of caution expressed that AI might be viewed as some sort of cure-all or magic remedy for cybersecurity, and that it shouldn't be. And that perhaps for cybersecurity, the biggest impact may be focusing on automation and not AI machine learning per se. We had a healthy conversation about the DARPA Cyber Grand Challenge, where they essentially asked the question, is it possible to automate cybersecurity? And in particular, they focused on reasoning about software flaws, formulating patches, and implementing those patches in real time. Bottom line, it was really successful, and that many of these objectives were accomplished. How those objectives were accomplished was sort of less important than that they were accomplished. So again, there was this sense that let's be a little bit cautious about the focus on AI versus a focus on automation. Another key finding, and I'll go through these pretty quickly, was that we talked about how AI can be used to attack through the entire cyber kill chain, and in different ways to do that. All the way from reconnaissance, all the way through the 7 stages. Certain AI technologies will be better at different stages than others, but that they will all increase over time. One other observation I'll share that came out of our workshop was that there seemed to be some sense that attackers would be more willing to use AI to attack than defenders would use AI to defend. And this is, somewhat understandable in as much as, AI technologies are newer. There's probably a degree of trust associated with some of the older, reliable technologies. But you do have this concern that, if the attackers are willing to use these newer technologies, maybe they sort of gain an advantage and stay ahead. And that leads to sort of the final point. We talked a bit about kind of this general notion of how will AI change cybersecurity. And in some sense, there was this discussion about how cybersecurity is inherently a cyber arms race. So the defenders do something, the attackers do something, the defenders do something, and so forth. And that AI is a key in the evolution, and AI is likely to accelerate to fuel the cyber arms race. Okay, a little bit of a long answer, but I'll stop there.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I appreciate you distilling 100 pages for us in about 2 minutes. I think there's something really important that you started off with there at the top about the differences between the automation and AI, meaning either machine learning in particular. And I'd actually want to turn to Nidhi here, because there's something about kind of the real world implications of focusing regardless of either just automation or machine learning. And we've had several different instances, particularly I think we talked about the Colonial Pipeline attack, right? And whether that is an example of a limitation within machine learning at play. And to Fred's point, like, would it have been better served to focus on the automation portion, right? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Thanks for the question, Christina. Hello, everyone. So I'm glad that you asked this question. It can be quite a misconception that automation and machine learning is the cause or the root of most of the problems. But the root of most of the problems are humans. Especially in the case of the Colonial Pipeline breach, the hackers were able to access passwords, through which they were able to breach the Colonial Pipeline system. And how did they get those passwords? From the dark web. Those passwords were available in the dark web. But while it was not a machine learning problem, it was definitely a moment of reflection and action. And not just action, aggressive action action which needs to be taken now, so that we can do what needs to be done to defend our overall national IT infrastructures. And because they were talking about scale at a national level, we're talking about securing these digitized, sensor-enabled IT infrastructures, chemical plants, healthcare, and the energy grid. All of these are now connected with the internet, which makes it even more important for us to make sure that the cyber attacks like the Colonial Pipelines, are minimized. We are going to see them, but what can we do? So I believe that because of the scale, the complexity, and because only automation is the answer, humans cannot really ensure that these infrastructures are secure all the time. AI will be one of the leading tools in securing these infrastructures. I do want to clarify there's a big difference between AI and machine learning, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, that's great. I think we should let's dive into that, because I think, one of my, what we want to do is anticipate, right? I think there is the want to not just be on the defense, I think, figure out how, not just be on the attack, think about defense proactively. And I'm curious for either one of you, what advancements, either within the AI space, which we can define as a group here, or in machine learning, can be useful to help anticipate what some of those large-scale cybersecurity threats might be, or the needs might be. I'd like to throw it over to Fred first to see if you have any immediate thoughts there.
Yeah, sure. No, and Nidhi makes a really good point. So I'll sort of key off her cue there. People talk about AI and machine learning as if they're the same. They are very different. It would be a long conversation to sort of talk about what the differences are. But maybe one way to kind of think of it was back in the late 90s, there was this big deal about how a computer beat the best human chess player. So this was the late 90s, and there was a big deal about that. That was based on so-called good old-fashioned artificial intelligence, sort of symbolic reasoning, brute force, kind of understanding of the game and so forth. And then 20 years later, there was another big event where a computer beat the best human Go player. And same thing, big press releases and so forth. The technology used to beat the best human Go player is really different then the technology used to be the best chess player, much like Nidhi describes. And it's machine learning, deep learning neural networks that cause the latter accomplishment. Very different. And so much of what is talked about today in terms of artificial intelligence really is machine learning, and these machine learning, deep learning techniques that have come about over the past 10 years or so have made just tremendous advances. To specifically answer your question, and Nidhi kind of touched on it a little bit, you have to sort of ask yourself, what are the various technologies good at as it pertains to cybersecurity? So again, we can sort of go back to the cyber kill chain, and these machine learning technologies that we talked about that have been very popular, have made great advances over the past 10 years or so, are really good at detecting patterns and making predictions. So if you sort of if you look at things that are sort of left of boom, left of the attack, reconnaissance, surveillance, that sort of thing, machine learning technologies can be quite good at that. They have the ability to process lots and lots of data, discern patterns in that data, and if they're able to detect patterns that look like they are different from a normal safe pattern, it might be sort of a cue towards, gee, this might be something that is looking like an attack. So I think those machine learning technologies, as applied to sort of detecting, identifying if an attack will happen, I believe are pretty promising, and I hope we'll see more of those technologies.
That's great. And Nidhi, I think to that same line that Fred just mentioned, I'd also like to hear what advancements within machine learning or even AI decide. But also kind of to that end, I think we have this massive data collection question that is in front of all of us, and yes, security, not really the other side of the coin is privacy, but I would love to kind of hear your thoughts on that dependency for these technologies to be successful, and whether that is the necessary component, particularly in that cybersecurity space, given, as you said, the scale of some of the things that we're trying to protect.
Yeah, and I'm glad that Fred brought up those examples where the machine was able to learn how the human was performing in different games, Go, chess, Jeopardy, all of these. So what is recently happening is that machines are able to learn from human moves, and they're able to learn far more, faster, and at a larger scale than we humans can ever do. Which brings me back to the point that I left off when you were asking the previous question, AI versus ML. So the professor inside of me wants the audience to have complete clarity. AI is not the same as machine learning. AI is a larger, it's a much broader domain. And what AI does is that the goal of AI is to make machines smarter and more intelligent, and get it as close as possible to human intelligence. Versus what machine learning does is that it's basing its learning off of data without explicitly programming, the prediction capability or the decision-making capability. So the difference between machine learning and AI is more or less that machine learning is data-driven, whereas AI can be driven by not just technology, not just data, can be driven by context, can be driven by knowledge. It can understand bias. So that's where AI and machine learning are separate from one another. And that also is the direction that cybersecurity is taking and should be taking, that we are not just dependent on data. Data means learning patterns, what has been and what we have seen before. And that's how the machine learning algorithms are able to behave. What they've seen is what they've seen. What they've not seen is what AI will be able to do in those scenarios is be able to gracefully behave, gracefully make decisions in those scenarios. So that's the difference between AI and machine learning. But the larger goal for the security community is to be able to is to be able to handle false positive alarms. That's just the holy grail of what we are trying to solve, is to solve the false positive alarms, because what that leads to is more and more security analysts spending their time trying to figure out, where did this come from? Why is it a false alarm? Is it a false alarm? And that just, it's a rabbit hole that they have to dig into. So AI, on the other hand, will be able to provide context, will be able to provide if the data which is making that decision, is it trustworthy? Is it fake? Is it coming from a reliable source? So those are the kind of advantages that we want to see in the computer security domain. And even more so when we are seeing deep fakes, fake news, and in more high-risk environments like autonomous vehicles, what we haven't seen, we haven't seen. How is the vehicle behavior supposed to, decide the direction of the vehicle? In those cases, adversaries or cyber criminals are able to take advantage of their knowledge and, insert adversarial examples or fake data in terms of images and so on and so forth. And that's what they're able to do. So, considering this kind of landscape that we are dealing with, we are turning more towards AI and more knowledge-based decision making.
Great, thanks. Fred, I would love to kind of get your feedback on what Nidhi just said on this movement towards something that's more knowledge, context dependent. And it sounds like the complexity of the problem space is warranting that, but whether, in this evolution that you've been a part of past several decades, is it there? Are we getting close to that? Or are we still fairly reliant on kind of the machine learning, data-driven approach?
One of the things we talked at least a little bit about in our workshop is that I think we'll look back on the decade of the 2010s as sort of the very early beginnings of the use of AI in cybersecurity, and there are a lot of older tools, non-AI based, that still continue to work pretty well. And people are going to hang on to them. But yeah, but I do think we're seeing in the latter part of the 2010s into the 2020s more use of AI. So we've seen use of AI and machine learning techniques on the part of the attackers, and we're seeing more and more use of AI and machine learning techniques on the part of the defenders. I agree with Nidhi. I do think the use will continue to go up, but it's fair to say, some of the older tools still continue to work pretty well. And I shouldn't call them older; they're modern tools, but they aren't necessarily based on AI machine learning kinds of techniques.
Yeah, related to that, I guess if you're trying to evaluate, let's say you're a private industry or an organization that's trying to decide, like, is AI, machine learning, or these older set of tools most appropriate? What are some of like the big things you would tick off to make that decision?
Yeah. So I think it sort of starts off with first sort of avoiding the temptation that AI is going to be, kind of, checking the box. I'm using AI. I am therefore protected. And I think again with the advent of AI, you talked about it, and it's just such a buzz phrase now. Everybody's talking about it. There are companies that purport to use AI, but when then you look under the hood, maybe not so much. There was a statistic quoted in our workshop that said that 40% of European AI startups actually don't use AI, and so maybe that number is better now, but that was from a couple of years ago. But again, it's important to focus on the functionality of the tool rather than whether it uses AI or not. I'll make one other comment that you touched on it, but beginning to use some of these modern machine learning technologies sort of brings you into the world of big data. And if you're not part of that world, it's a really different world. So you have to worry about data acquisition, data curation, data cleaning, data governance, data provenance, is are the sources reliable and so forth. And so you better kind of be ready for all of that if you want to get into it. Again, as Nidhi said, having all this data is really valuable, but you better be careful about making sure you're looking after the data. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but various kinds of attacks that people make on data, data poisoning attacks, evasion attacks, adversarial examples. And there are just lots of ways in which you can, the attackers will sort of mess with the data that you have to be really careful about.
Yeah,
I just want to add to that, Kristine, that there is this concept in philosophy. It's called the Occam's razor concept. What it does, what it usually says, and it applies to machine learning, is that you use simpler tools. You use what is needed. You don't try to make things complex. If it's that's how it's going. You're going to get the solution. And that's exactly what Fred was referring to, is that just using AI for the sake of it will not solve your problems.
Yeah.
You need to know what the problem is and try to use simpler tools. And if machine learning is the way to go, like spam ham, machine learning is very good. There is little to no use of using contextual AI, because the false positives are low. They do not impact the people as much. But at what point do you start using more data is when things start to impact human lives. When having low false positive rates or low fewer alarms is necessary.
Right.
But if not, then even statistical tools are doing a very good job.
That's good. That's a good lesson to live by always, I think, right? And I'm glad you guys are moving us into this, because I think, related but distinct to this set of issues of kind of the use of AI as a tool within cybersecurity is also the question of how AI systems can themselves be secured. And Fred, you kind of alluded to this on the data side. And it's not just about augmenting security of data and computer networks, but I'm curious, both of your opinions, what are some of the risks of the increased dependence on AI for critical functions and all this, services within the cybersecurity field? Fred?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. So with the advent of AI, and again, it's just so popular. It's on your phone, it's on your tablet, it's on your laptop. when you watch a movie on Netflix or play a song on YouTube, you're going to get a recommendation for another movie or another song. It's all done by deep learning. The recommendations are really good, so it's just everywhere. It's very pervasive, and so we're going to have to deal with the fact that there are so many AI systems embedded in so much of what we do, that those systems themselves can be attacked. And the way in which you attack an AI system is fundamentally different than the way you might attack a non-AI based system because of all of these data concerns. And so there's this example I like to use with students where there was an autonomous vehicle that was trained to understand what a stop sign looked like. So a stop sign is a red hexagon with the letters STOP on there. Some researchers, I think this was up at the University of Washington, they started placing some masking tape over particular sections of the stop sign and caused the classifier to believe it was a 40-mile-an-hour speed limit sign. So here, right, where the way a machine sees, quote unquote, sees the world is very different than the way a human sees the world. You can place, make very minor changes to something and cause the classifier to make a big mistake. And so there's just this whole class of evasion attacks, ways in which I evade the classifier in ways that are pretty subtle and virtually impossible for humans to understand. Nidhi can maybe talk more about this, but then there's this whole issue of data poisoning. These data sets are required to train up the algorithms, to train up the classifiers. here's an example of a cow, here's an example of a horse, yes, no, and you just give it lots and lots of examples. But the extent to which an attacker can start tinkering with the data sets will cause the classifier to sort of go off the rails. And it's just another set of issues that that are faced when AI systems can be attacked.
Thanks, Fred. Nidhi, did you want to jump in?
Yes, I completely agree with what Fred said, and I had the same thoughts about training with certain data sets and what can we expect from the classifiers. Classifiers are basically decisions that we are getting from machine learning models. There are two main problems that I see in addition to what Fred already mentioned. One of them is, and I think it is a bigger problem, is the over-reliance on AI. Like on one hand, we are demonizing, that AI is going to take over the humankind and we need to protect our kind and whatnot. But at the same time, when things get automated, when we can just tell Alexa or Siri, tell me about the weather or how much time it will take me to get to school, we rely on that data. But those are more, benign cases. Cases become a little more challenging when we completely rely on new technology, which is trained out of still, AI is still in the nascent stage, I would say, but we are still heavily reliant on it. We become quickly reliant. And that I think is a very big problem because we are not questioning and therefore not aggressively improving what we already have. So for example, in the case of self-driving cars, an area that I'm very much interested in securing self-driving cars. 3 years ago, a driver in a fully autonomous Tesla car decided to finish up their video game while the car was navigating on its own and taking them from point A to point B. And unfortunately, they hit into an accident and it was fatal. That's an example of over-reliance on AI and too soon, too early. That's one of the areas that I'm concerned about. And what needs to be done is that we need to identify when to bring a human in the loop. At what point human needs to take over the AI or the machine learning decision-making capabilities. That in itself is a very important area of research and implementation. And other than that, I think Fred already mentioned some great examples.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different, as you say, vectors to which we could analyze here and get into in terms of weaknesses of using AI within cybersecurity. But alas, we are running out of time. So I just want to bring us home here and have you guys address one more question, if you don't mind. I think I would really kind of like to sit and unpack this scenario in which, not so distant future where our world is heavily automated, heavily decided upon by intelligent systems or agents. If you were a business owner or a cybersecurity expert, how does that change your approach to your system, right? Knowing that this is not too far from now, what would make it more resilient? Would love your final thoughts on either one of those. We'll start with Nidhi and then end it with Fred.
Sure. I think I have, like I mentioned, machine learning is different from AI. And AI, when we are building AI systems, we can't be just talking about technologists because it's going to be integrated into human lives. So we need to bring in people who understand bias, who understand psychology, who understand human behavior into building the technology at design stage, not post hoc. So I think that's one of the things we obviously need to keep in mind. And like I mentioned earlier, that knowing exactly when the human needs to take over AI decision capabilities will be very, very critical. To be able to know, that you're driving a car and there is a dinosaur, green colored dinosaur in front of you. It's actually a dinosaur and not a green landscape, so the car doesn't bump into it. So I think we need to know when human need to take over.
Thank you, Nidhi. Fred, final word from you.
Yeah, very similar kind of comments. I think it's sort of this, this issue of you'd love for the AI to sort of be in control. And I think we're into this sort of ethical issue of can we versus should we. I'd be pretty nervous about a world where the machine on its own was making all the decisions. And you have to, I think, kind of think about what are humans good at versus what are machines are good at. And so what are humans good at? We're pretty good at abstraction. We're good at intuition. We're good at creativity, probably pretty good at oversight. What are machines are good at? They're good at precision. They're good at brute force. They're good at scale. They're good at speed. So the extent to which you have the machines do what they're good at, which could take some significant portion of the load away from humans, but don't leave it all to the machines, right? Machines aren't good at some of those things that are really important that just need to get done. So I think we just have to sort of think really carefully about what the balance looks like.
Amazing. I would like to thank you so much, both Nidhi and Fred, for joining us today, and right on time, send it back to Aspen for the next session. Thank you all.
Okay, bye.
Thanks for having us. Bye.